Today we're going to be talking about the causes of the Russian Revolution. After you've finished listening to this video and taking your notes, you should be able to do the following. Identify and describe the major causes of the Russian Revolution. If you cannot identify and describe these causes, please look back through your notes and, if needed, listen to the video again. So let's get started. So let's start with what's going on in Russia by the 1800s. By this point in time, it's still not considered to be modern based on the standards of other places elsewhere in the world, specifically Europe, because by this point in time, Europe is going through the Industrial Revolution. And one of the things that kept Russia sort of lagging behind was that they still used the feudal system. If you remember from 9th grade what the feudal system was, it's that exchange for land for loyalty, with kings and nobility, knights, peasants, serfs, and so on. And most places around the world had gotten rid of this feudal system by this point in time, and many of them even saw it as being wrong, because the idea of serfdom was essentially, being tied to the land and almost slave-like. And this agriculturally based society kept them from modernizing, kept them from advancing. And this lack of development became even more obvious in the mid-1800s when Tsar Nicholas I threatened to take over part of the Ottoman Empire. And the part that they were trying to take over was an area to allow Russia to have more warm water ports. This did not turn out well for the Russians, as they lost in 1856 against a weakening Ottoman Empire. And this was a really bad move for Nicholas I, as it kind of showed the rest of the world that big bad Russia couldn't take on this weakening empire. That brings us to Alexander II. Now, Alexander II realized, okay, we need to do something to modernize. We're lagging behind. He was cognizant of that fact. So he decides to come up with a plan to end feudalism. Now, it's great to have a plan, but this plan was not logical. In 1861, he starts by freeing the serfs. So he gives them all of their freedom. But now you have a lot of people who don't have land and therefore don't have jobs. So he decides to redistribute the land, and he does that by dividing it in half. Half of it goes to the peasants, while the other half goes to the upper class nobility. But this is where it's not logical. One, way more peasants than there are nobility, so it really wasn't equal land distribution. The second thing is that the government paid for the nobility's land. So the nobles didn't have to buy their land. The government paid for it for them. But they required the peasants to have to pay for their land within 49 years, or until 1900. After that, the peasants would either have to give up their land or it'd be taken over. This makes no sense. The peasants don't have the money to be able to pay for that, but yet they're requiring them to have to pay for it. And this was a strategic move on the behalf of Alexander II, because he realized that this was a way to keep the nobility sort of under his belt. He was able to keep them on his good side. So over the next 49 years, the land ended up being sold back to the nobility because the peasants couldn't afford it, and by 1900 they're back in the same boat. This led to his assassination in 1881. He is replaced by his son Alexander III. Alexander III was not a nice guy. Under Alexander III, he upheld the same principles of autocracy and single-party ruling that the other czars had put into place. He used strict censorship, that is like censorship of certain ideas and opinions. You weren't allowed to speak out against the government. He also followed a policy of Russification, that is forcing Russian culture onto different ethnic groups within Russia. Like the Balkans, Russia, especially Western Russia, had a lot of different ethnic groups. And those different ethnic groups followed different religions, different cultures, different languages, but this was not allowed under Alexander III's reign. They were forced to practice Russian culture, speak the Russian language, and follow Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Additionally, he persecuted the Jewish population, organizing violent acts against them called pogroms. And this is where you start to see in both Western Russia and Eastern Europe this idea of anti-Semitism, a hatred for the Jews. And this will follow right through until the Holocaust. And Alexander III used his secret police to keep all of this under his control. Then we have Nicholas II, who becomes Tsar in 1894. And like with the other Tsars, he vows to keep this policy of autocracy going. But by the 1890s, he's got a program in place to try to modernize Russia. And what he decides to do is try to increase taxes and build foreign investment. By bringing in money that way, they were able to build industries. And this worked. By 1900, they're the fourth largest steel producer in the world. But that does not come with problems. Some of the problems included harsh working conditions, low wages, and child labor being used. We've seen problems like this before. When? If you were thinking the Industrial Revolution, you are absolutely correct. Anytime you see rapid industrialization, like in England, in the US, and now in Russia, these kinds of problems are going to crop up. So by the early 1900s, people are already tired of not just the treatment of the czars, but the idea of czars in general, the idea of absolutism. People in Europe had been sick of it since the 15 and 1600s, going back to the Sun King and Louis XIV, but now the Russians are getting sick of it too, especially because many of these czars are becoming so maniacal, and many of their policies are not working. So revolutionary groups start to develop, and many of them follow the views of Karl Marx. Do you remember what was Marx's philosophy concerning revolution? If you were thinking anything about the haves, or the bourgeoisie, versus the have-nots, or the proletariat, you would be correct. Remember that Karl Marx's philosophy said that during the Industrial Revolution, the situation for the proletariat, the have-nots, would get bad. Bad working conditions, child labor, injuries, dangerous working conditions, all of those things would get so bad that they would overthrow the industry leaders, the capitalists, or the haves, the bourgeoisie, and take over the means of production. When they took over the means of production, they would redistribute it to everyone, and everyone would be equal. Eventually, the need for a government would no longer exist, and that would bring about true communism. So for these revolutionary groups, they believed that in this case the industrial class, or the working class, would overthrow the Tsar. But the biggest reason why this doesn't work in the long term is that they don't have a huge industrial working class. And in 1903, these groups split, going sort of two different ways in terms of what they think should happen. The Mensheviks wanted popular support. That is, they wanted to get the word out and get as many people to follow behind them as they could so that they could overthrow the Tsar. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, said that if they had just a small number of people who were willing to put forth everything, that would be enough for change. And the Bolsheviks had a really good leader by the name of Vladimir Lenin. So by the early 1900s, many events start to take place, none of which are good for Russia. The first is the Russo-Japanese War, and we've talked about this before. As part of the Russo-Japanese War, this was Japan's intent was to come out and try to start taking over areas for the purpose of imperializing. They wanted control of Korea and Manchuria, which Russia had some control over and had been using for natural resources as markets for their goods at this point in time. So when the Japanese come in and try to take over parts of this becomes a problem. And Russia starts to break agreements about who can go where. This leads to Japan attacking a Russian port in 1904. And Japan easily defeats Russia. This is another one, like the Crimean War, a blow to the Russians because it shows how weak they are, both militarily and the Tsar himself. Then you have issues at home within Russia, something called Bloody Sunday, or the Revolution of 1905. On January 22nd, about 200,000 workers marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And they were going there to try to convince the Tsar Nicholas, to give them a couple things, including better working conditions, more freedoms, and an elected legislator. That is, basically, they wanted to get rid of the idea of true absolutism, an absolute monarch. Needless to say, Nicholas wasn't there, and things didn't go well. The military opened fire on the crowd, killing between 500 and 1,000 people. By October of that same year, Nicholas does make some agreements, and he promises more freedoms and to create the Duma. The Duma was the first Russian parliament. Even though he decided to create it, agreed to create it, it was dissolved after only about 10 weeks or 2.5 months. The final blow to the Russians in all of this that leads to the revolution is World War I. In 1914, Russia enters the war. If you remember, they enter the war on the side of the Allied powers. They were originally part of the Triple Alliance. And within the first year, 4 million Russians had been killed, wounded, or taken as prisoners of war. And because they were lagging behind, and because the Central Powers cut them off from their supply lines coming from the British and the French, they just weren't prepared to deal with all of this. And like with many of these other wars that they had lost, it just showed people just how weak Russia was, specifically how weak Tsarist rule was. So in an attempt to try to save face, in 1915, the Tsar moves to the war front. That is, he goes to the Eastern Front and actually fights alongside the Russian soldiers. But this becomes a problem because he leaves the Tsarina Alexandra there to run the government. Now, to give you a little background to understand what happens here, Tsarina Alexandra and the Tsar Nicholas had a son together, Alexis, and this son had a condition known as hemophilia. It's a blood disorder. And Tsarina Alexandra put a lot of trust into a guy by the name of Rasputin. Rasputin was sort of a healer that helped with Alexis's condition. So when the Tsar leaves and goes to the front lines, she ignores many of the political advisors that the Tsar had put into place and instead puts her trust into Rasputin because basically he had saved her son. Now, a lot of people did not like Rasputin, and that's because as he's making these political decisions or helping her to make them, he puts into place people that are close to him, family members and friends, into high political positions, and they're just not making good decisions together. So to try to end all of the corruption that is taking place under Rasputin, many of these political advisors sort of schemed together to kill Rasputin. So they lure him to the Tsar's mansion and feed him cakes laced with poison. But here's the thing. Despite the fact that they put enough poison in these cakes to kill a horse, it had no effect on him. So, when that didn't work, they shot him several times, and assuming that he was dead, wrapped his body and threw it into the Neva River. Now, here's kind of the ironic thing. 3 days later, they find his body, and an autopsy is performed. When they figure out the cause of death, it was not due to the poison cakes, and it was not due to being shot. He actually drowned in the river. And Rasputin makes a very eerie prediction just a few months before his death. He told the Tsarina, "If I die or you desert me, in 6 months you will lose your son and your throne." Over the next few days, we will learn more to find out if he was right.